years at work and we don't ever really stop to think to ourselves, what does this all really actually mean? How does this actually connect my faith? How does my faith connect with my work? In this episode, we're exploring how seeing work as more than just a paycheck can shift your perspective and maybe even your whole life. Welcome back to another episode of the Reason to Behold podcast with Tony Talks.
And Arnold Reasons. Just before we get started,
Run
those
it,
are
bro.
probably some of my favorite bits, to be honest, when you do that, because I have no idea where you're going.
But is work more than just a paycheck? Right? I think it's an important
Good
conversation,
question.
bro, because I think, you know what it's like? I think when I remember when I was younger, right? There were
Mm,
two key things that I wanted to do. I wanted to make money. I wanted to be able to be
mhm.
old enough to drive a car legitimately, right? Those were my two big life ambitions when I was a child, bro.
Okay.
Or two of them
Okay.
anyway. And I think the journey goes on. Eventually I surrender, I enter the faith, say bye-bye to the old life, and
Yeah.
you end up eventually going through maybe studying, doing a degree or whatever qualifications and just getting into the working world, right?
Mm,
And I think it's so easy, I have seen personally, to just end up going into some sort of a rhythm where, Monday morning, back to the grind, do
yeah.
Tuesday, do Wednesday, do Thursday, do Friday. Thank God it's Friday. Maybe hang out, do some things on a Saturday, and then maybe go to church, hang out with family, whatever you're going to do on a Sunday too. And that routine just kind of like ticks over and over and over. And I think within that, there are so many ways, like it goes into other areas of life too, but specifically with work,
Mm,
I can think back on years that probably passed where I didn't really sit down to consciously reflect on how does the work that I'm doing connect with the
mm,
faith that I'm professing? How does what I'm
mm,
doing Monday to Friday full time connect with the journey that I seem to be encouraging myself on, exhorting myself in when I'm reading the scriptures, when I'm meeting with other believers on a Sunday or whenever? Like, how does that all interrelate?
mm,
Um, and I think another point worth mentioning as to why that maybe wasn't so much my thought was because something that was common at that time, I remember, was that yes, we were meeting together with other believers. Yes, we were encouraging, exhorting. Yes, we were reading the scriptures. But it seemed like there was an undertone of your work almost being like a distraction from the mission, right?
yeah. Yeah.
And so I thought this would be a good
Mm,
conversation to really dig into because, spoiler alert, I believe your work is something sacred and as important to God as
mm,
the thing that we identify as the mission of God, right? Because I actually believe that his
yeah.
mission involves our work, it involves our businesses and whatever we're doing outside of our holy meetings, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, let me know your thoughts to begin, bro.
So I think what's really interesting is that while you were talking, I was just thinking about in the Bible, who do we see at work, right?
Mm,
And in a sense, when you think about like Joseph, when you think about Daniel, all those guys, they
mm,
were slaves more than they were employees, if that makes sense. Sometimes I feel like we are slaves as employees, but that's a
yeah.
whole other matter.
Mm,
But you don't really see lots about people at work. Even Paul, we know he was a tent maker, but we don't see lots about him at work. We know
mm,
that Jesus was a carpenter, but we don't see much about him at work. We just see the
mm,
ministry side of things. I think the closest that it might be that I might think of, even he was tricked into almost being a slave, was I think it was Jacob who had to work for his wife, right? With his father-in-law. And he had to work 7 years for the first one, which he got tricked into. 2 years for the 7 years for the second one, he got tricked again. But his father-in-law was tricking him even once he had the wives, because it talks about the sheep and the spotted sheep and the fleck sheep. But that's the only time I can really think about where you see someone actually at work in the Bible. Like, where else have you seen that?
I think so. My mind actually goes back to I think where we first see it, which is in Genesis, when it says that the Lord God put the man in the garden
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
that he could
To
work
work
there and
the to
keep it.
work the garden. Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I think even on the point about slavery, it's an interesting one, right? Because in a lot of ways, I think that we can take lessons and observations about employment from a lot of the things we see about slavery. Now, don't get me wrong, like I'm not talking
Absolutely.
about like the
No,
most
yeah.
aggressive stuff, right? Because
No.
in 2024, like I'm not likening what we're doing right now to some of the most aggressive forms of slavery, but I do believe
No.
in a lot of ways, like if we really strip it down to its bare bones, I actually think that we're kind of like within employment settings, we're pretty much privileged slaves, bro. Like,
Bro, but think about this, yeah. When it comes when it comes back to the fall, what did God say? He said about your work will come at the sweat of your brow. You'll
yeah,
have to work super hard. Like, bro, the way that we work right now, I
mm,
don't think was the intention for work personally.
mm,
So I think like the privileged slave thing, like in a way we actually are, bro. Like we're a slave to our
yeah,
paychecks. Like let's be really real about it. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
like there are people who work for fun, like Elon Musk, bro. Like he works for fun. He just loves
mm,
what he does. But how
mm,
many people can say that they have an Elon level love of what they do, that they would do it even if they weren't getting paid to do it? Do you see what I
mm,
mean? So
mm,
I actually agree with you, and that's what I found interesting is that the people we really get insight into at work were the people that were in slavery. That
mm,
for me was really really interesting.
mm,
I don't remember seeing like King David. He was a king. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
mm,
it's not the same. Even King Solomon, he was a king. It's not the
mm,
same. But the people that we see that are probably most like us in the New Testament, and do you know what? Maybe this is where this kind of ministry versus secular thing comes from. Because even the disciples, when they were working and they were working too hard, they said it's not good for us to be doing the tables. Let's get some people who are filled with the Spirit and whatever to take over. But even that wasn't like work where they're going to get paid, right? And that's where like this ministry versus secular thing, I think that's where some of that comes from, because we don't see lots of things about work in the Bible.
I think there are though, you know. Because
When?
I think
Where
because
do
I
you see
think
someone going to
so.
work?
Okay, so like because the thing is, when you say where do you see someone going to work, I think that's probably based on our modern view of the world, right? Because like Paul, for example, he was a tent maker at one point.
Yeah,
We
but
know that from
bro,
scriptures, right?
there's no letters where he said, you know, when I was at work today and this happened. Like, and that's what I mean by we don't see much about work. Like, I know Paul was a tent maker and
Yeah,
Jesus was a carpenter, right?
yeah,
But where do you see more about their working lives? The one I can think of is the you know the story about the workers who were called to work in the field and they got 1 denarii and then the later people got the same amount as them. That's where I can see like a workplace dynamic. But
So
all of these things, it's like, okay, yeah, go on.
no, go on, finish first, bro.
So for me, it's like we know Paul was a tent maker. We know he did work,
Yeah,
and that was kind of his choice to work so that
yeah,
he wouldn't have to rely on people to support him, right?
yeah.
Jesus was a carpenter. We know that, but I don't know anything about Jesus's day-to-day work, you know?
So what would you be so if you were to describe what it is that you're saying isn't there, how would you describe it in as
Yeah.
much detail as possible?
So I think the depths of talking about the work environment, right? Like, for example, we have to kind of take principles from Proverbs and apply it to our work, if
Mm,
that makes sense. I can't tell you what Jesus was like at work, other than, well, I know that he would have worked as unto God, right? Which is my interpretation of how Jesus is at work. I
mm.
can't tell you what Paul was like at work. Like, bro, what was Paul like at work? Like, I don't know. Do you know? Like, I just know that he made tents so that he can make a living. You know,
Mm.
that's not a career as such. You know, like he didn't climb the corporate ladder, even though they would have been the corporate ladder. Joseph was the second in command, right?
Yeah, but I think the corporate ladder, though, I think is again a very modern construct, right? Because,
I agree.
and I think that's probably the
But
reason
also, I
why there are
disagree.
going to be gaps. Go on, tell me
Nah,
why not.
bro.
Tell me
Daniel,
why not.
yeah, they did corporate espionage on Daniel. Yeah,
What do you mean?
like from way back then. So the people who tried to get Daniel thrown in the lion's den,
Yeah.
like there were levels and ranks within their organization, and that's the corporate ladder, and that's what I'm talking about. Like those are where we see how people navigated corporate.
Sorry. So what is it that you're saying is missing?
So what I'm saying is, for me, is that the reason I think that people make such a big separation between the two is
Yeah.
because we don't see lots of things in the Bible where people are going to work and how they engage in a work environment. We see
Okay.
slaves being told this, we see masters being told this, but where do we see people like you and me going to
Yeah.
work?
So I disagree with that.
Okay. How so?
And there are some listeners that might be happy to hear that we have a disagreement on something. But so I think more so on the point as to whether that is what it is that causes that divide. Because I
Okay.
think what I will say is, I think whether or not we believe that there is much information on what work life was like for people in the scriptures or not,
Mm.
one of the things that I do believe about the journey of faith is that, like, what the scriptures don't do on every single area of life is say, this is exactly how you need to do it, and these are the parameters within which you must definitely not go beyond, right? There are some things that are prescriptive, right? But I think what we do discover along the journey is like there are just certain characteristics and traits that are being built within us from the text that we do have, from the principles that we do know, which are supposed to outwork into manifesting what godliness looks like in these different areas of life, right? And I say that based on the fact that the scripture speaks about how he has given us all things pertaining to life and godliness, right? So even though there is a possibility that there is not necessarily a step-by-step playbook of this is what you do in the corporate environment, this is exactly how you need to behave, this is exactly what you need to do on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, within what we do have and the revelation that has been revealed, I believe that there is supposed to be enough, sufficient, that if we stare at and learn to practice, not just hear, but to do these things enough, we will, like, the output will reflect what his desire is in that area.
And I agree with, right? I'm not expecting an exact play-by-play for work.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that marriage, we see quite a lot of stuff about, right? We see quite a lot of stuff about ministry and church and things like that. What I'm saying is I don't see lots of things around work, and I think that that's where sometimes people think that work isn't as important in terms of life and godliness.
Which is, but, and then I think that's where I think I wouldn't agree to say that's why they don't see it as that. I think that's probably down to a poor view of what the journey of a disciple should be like, and I think that's their problem.
Remember, I don't agree.
No,
right?
no, no,
I
no,
don't
no.
agree
I'm not,
with,
bro.
with
This is
why
not me
people
talking about
think
you.
that. Yeah.
I'm talking about what
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it is that's
I don't
behind
agree
the
with that.
reason. Because that whole sacred secular thing, I think, comes from traditions of men, and a perception of what godliness looks like, what it looks like to be a Christian, right? Like, it's this view of the pulpit and the pew, like the difference between the people that are within the sacred kind of vocations versus those who just seem to be the ones that come to benefit from them, right? And if you really want to go there, I think the problem is that we're too busy breastfeeding when we should really be going out and hunting, bro. Like, I think we've spent too much time sitting down and depending on other people to produce milk from all of their hard work and labor, rather than actually saying, hold on, like, I'm a big man. Why am I still on the, like, and I think that's part of the problem. We don't take responsibility enough as disciples, because, like, let's say that is the case. Let's say that, like, okay, let's even give another example, right? I can't think of something explicit within the scriptures, right? Because let's just assume that what you said is 100% it. There isn't anything, or there isn't much on it, right? If that is the case, then what? Do you get what I'm saying? Especially if I know that I'm living in a world where I have to work, what then becomes my then next step? Is it that I only then develop a perspective of what I'm supposed to do as a Christian within work when somebody else takes the time to go away and study and now share that with me? Or do I make a decision to say, you know what? Though I may not see what I think is directly applicable, what can I observe from what is there? And sometimes, and I think this is the other thing as well, sometimes it's because it's not necessarily as complex as we might think it is, right? Because in a lot of ways, right, I'm not saying there's no nuance to complexities within the workspace and all that, right? But I think some things are very basic. The bar is very low. We talk about it all the time on this podcast, bro, right? Be faithful in what you do. Work heartily as unto God. Even Colossians, bro, yeah? Even if you just took that Colossians verse that you mentioned earlier of whatsoever you do, work heartily as unto God, not as unto men, not doing things as based on eye service, but like working as though God is your boss. Just take that. My guy, I promise you, it will go well with you. Like, And
Yeah.
within that
Yeah.
as well,
Yeah.
it will force you to now start looking at all of these other things, because if he's the boss, there's so many things we know about what does please him, right? And so now I'm thinking
Mm.
about, okay, so
Mm.
what should my work ethic be like? What should my time need? Should I be lazy, or should I be looking at scriptures like what we spoke about, Proverbs? Go to the ant, you little sluggard. Right? No, not little. It didn't. I added little, but go to the ant, you
Mm.
sluggard. Right?
Mm.
Consider her ways. So I think that
Yeah.
happens when we become a lot more proactive, right? And we become a lot more responsible for our development of reflecting, I guess, his ways in different areas of life. Those are some of my thoughts.
I think the proactive and the responsible thing is such a massive thing, because I think both of us are big believers in extreme responsibility.
Come on.
Right? Like,
Yeah, man.
I don't care what else is happening. Let me own what I can own. And that's where I think that I can understand why we think the way that we think, right? Because for me, let me go hunt. Yeah. Let me go kill what I can eat. But I think that, especially the society we live in now as well, it doesn't promote hunters,
Mm.
right? It's a convenience society. It's about as easy as you can make it. And that's where I think that in trying to understand this sacred versus secular divide, it just
Yeah.
seems like this is a part of our life that God isn't really that interested in. That's what it looks like sometimes. For a lot of people that think that way, is that like, well, they think that way because they think God doesn't care about what I do for my work. I just do my work so that I can make my living. But for me, it's like God still had a plan for us to do work from the beginning without the curse.
Yeah,
right?
man.
That was part of his perfect plan, was that
Mm.
we do something. So he is interested in our work. He does want to, and that's the thing, he wants to help us with our work. How often do we just try and do our stuff without asking for help from God? He wants to be involved in everything in our lives, right? And that's the thing for me, is that we need to be proactive and responsible, but at the same time, like, receive the help. Like, bro, so
Yeah.
one of the things that my dad talks about is how, because of Jesus, we're redeemed from the curse of the law. So my work doesn't have to be as hard as what the curse said it should be. So why am I working like a slave when I could just ask for help? When I can have favor, when God can tell me what needs to happen. Do you know what I mean? Why am I still working like I'm under the curse? Like it has to be by the sweat of my brow. I still need to put in the work. Don't get me wrong. God still loves, he loves those who diligently seek him. He rewards those who diligently seek him. There is something about diligence that God honors. So I still need to do my part, but it doesn't need to be the same way as the curse says it needs to be.
Yeah, man.
Hmm.
Another point on it. I know we talk about money a few times here, but I think it becomes relevant, right? Especially if we're talking about work, because I think like I've had conversations with believers, and I genuinely can understand, and like I feel where they're coming from in it, because it's something that I had to wrestle through as well at a point. But I've had conversations where you can see and you can feel the tension on them feeling like there is almost something morally questionable about them getting increased income, right? Because pay rises, totally, don't do that, bro. Pay rises lead to more money, which leads to a fear of basically becoming someone who is deemed as being too worldly and too earthly, and also someone who, I guess, is rich, right? And depending on how you feel about and what you believe, depending on what you believe about wealth, riches, and like how that does or doesn't reconcile with being a faithful believer, will determine how you're going to feel about and what you're going to do about those opportunities to be promoted, how aggressive you may be, or even if you don't want to use the word aggressive, because maybe not everybody does it in an aggressive fashion, right? But how strong and confident you may be when it comes to having conversations around pay rises, promotions, and maybe even going for jobs which are significantly higher earning than what you're in right now. What are your thoughts on some of those things, bro?
I think that it's going to be, to be honest, it's going to be quite a rare case, because like it's going to be quite a rare case where God is like, don't take that job, right? And it probably isn't really about the money, but it's probably about the environment. And if you're somebody that money is going to have you, then don't go for it, right?
Mm,
But I don't think that's the default, right? I don't think God's default is that he wants his people to be poor. I don't think that God's default is that he doesn't want people to have abundance. Like, even when you think about before the fall, he said, of all of these things
yeah,
you
man.
can eat, of all of these trees you can eat freely. There was abundance. But of this one tree, you may not eat. One tree. And that was because it was for our own good. God is a God of abundance. And if we can learn to live and work in his abundance, but also if we can learn to be conduits of his abundance, so it doesn't just stop with me, but it goes through me, why would he not want you to have it? Because,
Mm,
bro, if money is in the hands of Christians, it should be doing good things in the world, right?
mm,
And I think that's where the challenge is because, bro, even some of these non-Christian people, their goal is to get the money and give it away. They're not even Christian. They don't even have God. How much
mm,
more us? But
mm,
sometimes we're trying to get the money to store up treasures for ourselves, not because we want to be generous and we want to be a conduit. And maybe then, actually, no, you shouldn't have money if money's going to have you like that.
mm,
But I don't think that that's God's design and his plan for us. I really, personally, I don't.
mm,
I really don't. Because even like people like Elijah, who you might say he didn't have anything, he had provision, he had stuff. Like people, God sent ravens to feed them, he sent the
mm,
widow to feed them. He said, I've prepared a widow to feed you. Like, God is there to provide for us. Like, that's what he wants to do. So
mm.
for me, I don't believe that, like, that's not what he wants for us. But I'm more than happy to be proven wrong. More than happy to be proven
You heard it here first. Tolly is open to it. So if you've got something to say on it, holla.
wrong.
Holla. But I think it's an important point you're saying because even the verse that came to mind for me was Philippians, where Paul's speaking about how he's learned to be brought low, he's learned
Yep.
to abound, he's learned to have much, how to have little, he's learned to face plenty, as well as to hunger. But in all things, he's learned contentment effectively. And I think that's where, like, it's so important to, I think, to just lay aside our assumptions and even the assumptions that people may have given us, maybe the things that we may assume about the faith across the board, because like whether it's to do with the subject of wealth and money, work, relationships, like your job, all of that kind of stuff, there's whatever the subject is, there are always going to be extremes and errors that we
Mhm.
can fall in. And
Mm.
I think I've heard it several times, but the most dangerous lies are the ones that look the most like the truth, right? It's
Mm.
the
Mm.
it's
Mm.
the it's not necessarily just the bottle that says it's poison and has all of those hazardous signs on it. It's the bottle of drink, which is like a normal thing which you would otherwise consume, maybe a bottle of Fanta, maybe a bottle of Coke, maybe a bottle of water, depending on what you're on, that has a drop of poison. That
Mm.
little amount, which
Mm.
has enough to do you lots of damage, but if you don't realize that it's there, it just goes by unsuspecting. And I think there's so many things that we believe and we accept and we just don't question and interrogate. Like for me, when it comes to this journey of faith, bro, and I was thinking about this the other day, one of the greatest things that I think I did do right, and I still try to push on, like as my lifelong mission, is to just interrogate everything, right? Cross
Yep.
examine everything. Make no assumptions, just interrogate the text, interrogate my assumptions, interrogate what I'm told, and not like out of a arrogance or out of trying to constantly prove something wrong, but it's from a neutral perspective of, okay, this information is here, be it the scripture, be it the practice, be it the like, take that thing and assess it, review it,
Mm.
like
Mm.
analyze it, understand what it truly means rather than just going in blindly with assumptions. Because it's those assumptions, bro, that I think the assumptions and I think the things that we haven't taken the time to actually just think through that have the most scope to put us in danger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so important that we check these things.
Yeah. Yeah, man. So that being said, I think it's a good opportunity for us to wrap up.
Mm.
Yeah. So for those of you listening, what is it that you need to maybe think through that you haven't thought through before? What is it? What are some of the thoughts and assumptions that maybe you need to interrogate a little bit further, cross-examine a little bit further? When it comes to your work, have you taken the time to search the scriptures to see what God has to say about it? And how do you maybe need to consider making adjustments to make that connection between your faith and you being a believer and the work that you do being something that is sacred and not necessarily something separate from God? Those are some things to reflect on. We are done. We are out. We'll catch you on the next episode. Peace.
Peace.
I have no idea what happened, bro.
So, me neither.